welcome to the New Earth podcast, which will guide you towards awakening and the embodiment of your highest self through holistic living advice, science, yoga, personal experiences, and expert guests. Let's grow together and build a new Earth. I'm Nancy Crupi, I'm a scientist, and I have a PhD in biology and 15 years of international scientific research experience in fields from inflammation to aging, neurobiology, nutrition, metabolic disorders, and much more. I'm also a Kundalini Awakened spiritual teacher, healer, and coach, and I practice and teach Kundalini Tantra.
And I'm Robie Newman-Paris. I'm a biologist with experience in neuroscience, and I've studied the ancient yogic sciences as well as other Eastern philosophies with gurus and yogis while spending a year and a half in India and in Bali. I now teach Kriya Yoga, breathwork, and meditation and help guide people in their spiritual development. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the New Earth podcast. My name is Robie, and I'm a biologist and a yogi, and I'm joined by Nancy.
Hi, everybody. I'm a scientist. I'm a biologist as well. And I'm a spiritual teacher, Kundalini Awakened, a spiritual teacher. And we're here today to talk about trauma and ego. Two topics that seem to be kind of separate in a way, but are so intertwined that it's very important to talk about them together in a sense. And that we're going to be touching throughout the podcast episodes about these two topics separately. And we're going to go deeper in that. But today we're going to give a first introduction of what the trauma and the ego are and why they kind of cause each other, or they're so linked to each other. And first of all, we're going to be introducing also something new today, because during our podcast is also important for us to expose you guys to healthy products and things that support you physiologically speaking while you go through your own awakening. What I'm drinking today is Aloe Vera juice, actually, which is extremely antioxidants and anti-aging, and it's so important, to maintain your physiological functions. And I'm gonna add my rose water. This is incredible. It's called Rose Vibes, and this concentrated contains 44 Bulgarian roses. Rose water is something that people don't know very much, but it's extremely important for your health. It contains a lot of antioxidants, and also it's been used for thousands of years in ceremonies and spiritual ceremonies, and also in weddings, because it really has a vibration that heightens up, that uplifts you and brings you back to self-love and loving vibes. And so it contains a lot of good things for you, antioxidants and vitamins. And it's also very good for hormonal imbalances. It rebalances your hormones, but also it has a relaxing effect. I use it, for example, when I want to nap throughout the day, and I use it to relax me to sleep. And it really elevates my vibration so much, and it makes me sleep so easily. So it's very easy to use. You can just use a dropper under your tongue like this, or you can simply put it in your drink. It's very easy, and it's so good also because it smells like roses and it's good for you. And so remember, we also try to support small businesses around our area, especially. But if you guys have a small business and you want for us to support you, just let us know. This is Nico. This is a great guy. He's Bulgarian as well, and these roses are Bulgarian. So this is really straight from the source. And his website is drinkrosevibes.com, or you can find him on Instagram at drinkrosevibes and contact him. He's really nice, and he has a small business, so let's support small businesses. So let's start with our topic today. So trauma and the ego. What is your experience, Robbie, about trauma?
Yeah, thanks for first introduction of this beautiful rose water. I wish that I could taste it, but unfortunately I'm on the other side of the country, so I'm hoping that you enjoy for the both of us. And yeah, so to just jump in about trauma, I think that many people that are on the spiritual path, one thing that a lot of us have in common is the fact that we've encountered a lot of trauma in our life. And this is something that a lot of people encounter because trauma is one of those forces that really helps you to awaken. because when the intensity of your own trauma gets to a certain extent, it forces your mind to expand and look for other ways to deal with the suffering. And that's definitely something that I've experienced in my own life. I would say I really started to, work on myself, improve myself from around the age of 12. And, this did relate to trauma. And it was a lot from my personal experience was due to anxiety and my feeling of lack of confidence in myself, where, every time I was in a social situation, I was always hyper judgmental of myself. Like my mind was very active in the sense that it would always look for flaws in every action, every thought, everything I was saying. So when I was when I was in those states of anxiety, I would be looping into these, these negative thought loops, and it was causing a lot of mental trauma for me and a lot of emotional trauma as well, where, and it affected me in so many different ways, where I didn't have confidence in social situations. I had really terrible sleep because every time I would try to go to bed, my mind would just get stuck in these thought loops. Okay, like maybe I said this thing a little bit wrong, or I came across a little bit, awkward or something in this one social situation, and my mind wouldn't let me let go of that for days, weeks, sometimes even months. I'd still be stuck in these same negative thought loops. And even though I was still at a pretty young age, I realized that this was not sustainable. This is not the version of myself that I could be. This was not something that was making me happy. It was something that was causing me so much suffering. And so this trauma kind of pushed me to take steps outside of my comfort zone, to, rather than, taking this trauma and crumpling underneath the weight of it, rather to, push myself outside of my comfort zone, be brave, be fearless, conquer that kind of anxiety, conquer that fear, conquer those negative thoughts. And I mean, I did this in many different ways. I think in the beginning, I just kind of pushed myself in social situations. If I felt a little bit uncomfortable, I didn't hesitate. I didn't pull back and withdraw anymore. I put myself out there. I, even if something felt a little bit awkward, I said, no, I have to face this head on. I have to be there and I have to feel this feeling and I have to let it go. And that helped me to really grow and develop through my, through my adolescence, through my teenage years. Um, and then I started to also put in some other mental affirmations and other mental strategies for dealing with the negative thinking, because it's something that's, it's run in my family, but it's something that a lot of people deal with, which is, the comorbidity of anxiety and depression, right? You feel anxious in different situations. And then when you get stuck in those thought loops, it leads you into a depressed state because you get stuck in these patterns of habitual negative thinking about yourself. You think that, everyone is judging you. You feel like you're the center of everyone's negative thoughts and everyone views you in this negative way. And through this process, I've realized that there's three different ways that we kind of form an identity of ourselves in the world. Number one, it's directly what you think about yourself. So these are like the thoughts that just come to you based on your appearance, based on the way that you're acting in the world. Number two, and this is actually the smallest factor. It's a lot smaller than most people give it credit, but it's what other people think of you and the subconscious cues you're able to pick up on based on other people's behaviors, based on how other people are treating you. And the third one, which is the most insidious and also the most difficult to kind of identify, is the way that you think others view you and the way that you think others view you. And this can be a really big factor in understanding your own negative thought loops, because at least for me, I'd get in these states of just uncontrollable negative thinking where, I would see, okay, maybe I did something a little bit embarrassing, and I would think that the people involved in this situation were judging me and were thinking negative things about me, where in reality, maybe in the moment they're like, oh, that wasn't the most smooth thing to say, but then 5 seconds later they'd already forgotten about it. So where they released it and they weren't even thinking this was a thing, I was stuck on this. And all of these kind of recurrent cycles of trauma, of negative thinking and depression, I really started to become aware of them. And I started implementing techniques to, overcome my own negative thinking. I pushed myself exponentially into situations that maybe would make me feel a little bit uncomfortable, would make me kind of face that fear. And through kind of overcoming that adversity through situations and through my own positive reinforced mental patterns, I was really able to basically completely eradicate my anxiety and step out of the modality of depression. And it's obviously something that I'm still working on to this day. I can't say that I'm 100% clear of it because I am still human. I still have moments of anxiety. I still have moments of depression. But number one, I have so many tools now that I can use that are at my disposal so that when I get in that state, I recognize with my awareness what's happening and I can implement those tools. And then also, I have all of my past experiences and all of these, positive reinforced thought loops and habit loops that now just kick in automatically. So if I get stuck in this loop of negative thinking, I don't even have to put in the effort anymore most of the time. Usually my mind will just automatically start thinking positively and automatically start to contradict that negative thinking just because of the effort that I've put in the past and the work that I've already done. So that's a little bit about my experience with trauma. I'd love to hear also about what you experienced, Nancy, and how you kind of used the lessons from your trauma to develop and to grow and to be who you are now.
I would like to, first of all, add something to what you said regarding, because what you said is very interesting because, trauma is not, we tend to think of the universe as something that is just simply psychological or physical, almost as if these things are separate. The reality is that everything is just a different expression of energy. So energy is expressed in terms of matter and is expressed in terms of thoughts, because in the end, those thoughts are the result of your brain and how your brain functions. And so I like that you said it is also, you have a sort of familiar morbidity, like the familiar how do you say, you like there's a form of genetic component to it, because it's your family that is also prone to develop this sort of like depression of ruminations. Definitely. Right? Because the word rumination is really the important word, because it's really like a cyclical kind of thinking that becomes compulsive. And it's important to say that because it really depends from physiological parts of our brain, anatomical sides of our brain, that are structures that are there. It can be bigger, it can be smaller, it can be more or lesser developed, more or lesser active in different people in ways that also depend on genetics. And so that's why also there is this familiar component, because genetically speaking, we can be more prone to rumination or to compulsive thinking or to traumatizing ourselves through those things because of genetics. And also because genetics is also what determines our physical aspect. And so that also can be a component if we don't fit within the narrow reference model that at that time is the trendy model for the fashion, global fashion, like beauty models change through time so much. But if you're unfortunate enough to be born with within a certain beauty model, but 10 years later, then you're not beautiful anymore because it was beautiful 10 years ago. Now it's not trendy anymore. But, so all these things don't make any sense, but they're actually determined by our genetics. And so all these things actually are a component to trauma as well. And especially a part of the brain that is very important, fundamental for this specific rumination is the basal ganglia. Basal ganglia and the hippocampus, which are the parts of the brain together with the amygdala that are part of the limbic brain, the reptilian brain, and the fight or flight mode. And together they work to, trigger the trauma and become an inner source of trauma. Because at that point, you are traumatized by a comment that someone says, or by this embarrassment that you feel, or by looking in someone's eyes and seeing that they're judging you, or that they're thinking that you've done something wrong, or you've done something embarrassing. So what you see in other people's eyes traumatizes you, but then it is you who become the source of that trauma, because at that point that becomes cyclical in your brain and it starts ruminating. And so that person is not there. Their eyes are not there anymore. That moment is past. They're not even thinking of you anymore. It's just been a tiny second. Yeah, it's been a tiny second. Their eyes traumatize you for 1 second, but then it is your brain that perpetuates that trauma cyclically. So we are really like 99% of the times, we are the source of our own trauma, in a sense, that something externally happens, but that triggers something that then becomes internal. So that's really what we need to work on, the fight or flight mode. And so thank you for giving the inspiration to say this. And regarding my own experience of trauma, I feel like, as I said during the first episode, there, different kinds of trauma in the sense that I also had what to experience. Like I've been bullied a lot during school, for example, because I wasn't, I was kind of shy, introverted, and I wasn't the beauty model at that time, in a sense. And I was pretty anyways, but I didn't know that I was. I was very insecure, I lacked confidence. And I was in a very like hostile type of environment, in a sense. I grew up in a small village in the south of Italy where there is a lot of very like people that grow in the streets. And so it's kind of like a ghetto in a sense. It's really not, but it's almost kind of like a hood kind of vibe sometimes. And so people can be very aggressive in a sense sometimes, or very, they grew up in the streets, so they can be very out there, and I was this naive little kid. And so I was very delicate, a delicate flower in this very hostile environment, in a sense. And so I got bullied a lot, and I had a lot of what you said as well, like a lot of these ruminations of thinking, oh, I've done something embarrassing or done something wrong and I couldn't sleep but I feel like it was not as prominent as in your case. It wasn't really it was not my major form of trauma, because I had a lot of also family trauma due to, fights and different kinds of dysfunctions in my family. So I feel like that during my especially during my teenage years and stuff, that has been one of the major sources of trauma, like really fights. And like I had a lot of really kind of altercations, like real fights within my family. And so that has been very kind of traumatizing, even though I'm very resilient, I'm very strong. And so I can't say that those things truly traumatize me, in the sense that I tend to react by moving for elsewhere, and which is what I've done for my whole life. Like when I really feel like a place is hostile for me, I just move. And that's what I've been doing. I've changed house for like 12 times in my life. And so it's like that's really what I do. I kind of like, when I see that something is supposedly traumatizing, I just move from there elsewhere. So I feel like I don't internalize it as much. So my real trauma has happened later in life, when I awakened from all the gaslighting that I had gone through for 30 years or so. So once I awakened from narcissistic relationships and the existence of narcissism, which I was completely unaware of until then, as an adult, I realized I had to see my entire life under a completely different lens, and understand that I had completely misinterpreted a lot of things because I was being gaslit. So that has been a trauma for me, to like um, decide to accept that I had been a victim of abuse, decide to accept that I had gone through manipulations, decide to accept that I had been naive while other people were more aware than me and they were abusing of me. So I feel
It's a
like
hard
that has
thing to
been
accept.
the real trauma for me. Yeah, and it's hard because that's why a lot of people tend to get stuck in the victim mentality and to not move forward from there, because they tend to just really not want to see and to accept that they've been victims, especially men. This happens to men a lot more than women, because men specifically, society tells men that they have to be always in control. They have to be, owning their territory, owning their things, having their things together. So I feel like that thought of having to be in control, and realizing the realization that they have not been in control, and that they have been victims because they were not in control, because they have been vulnerable, because they were just letting go and putting their walls down. That is so hard to swallow for men, that they tend to stay in abusive relationships a lot longer than women, because they simply prefer the narrative, the fake narrative, to the truth, to not accept that they have been victims. So this is really traumatizing as an adult. So I feel like that has been my main trauma, and it took me a few years to like cleanse from it and to heal from it, because it was, again, like I had to really swallow not simply a trauma, but it was 30 years of lies, 30 years of naivete, 30 years of having a completely wrong perspective about myself, you know, and about what I was and what I was doing, what was actually happening around me. So that has been really like hard to swallow. And I'm like, I think it pushed me to become the best version of myself. So in the end, it was part of my journey, you know, like we are meant to go through trauma to bloom at the end. So it's all fine. But at the same time, that has been main trauma, I think, to like really see the truth. That has really been and I think for most people, that is really the main thing we need to awaken from, which is why today we're talking about the ego as well, because all that narrative is also ego in the end. And so seeing our own ego and reaching the ego, that is a trauma. And that's why most people don't reach it, other than using psychedelics, for example, or things that kind of lower our defenses and allow us to feel safe while seeing the truth as well, because the truth is hard. The truth is hard to swallow, to see that we have, you know, hidden this trauma in grandiosity. We have built a perfect package, you know, that looks pretty and nice and golden, and it hides a very deep hole, darkness that we don't want to think about. That's trauma, you know. That's trauma. The fact that we don't love ourselves, the fact that we don't think we're enough, the fact that we feel embarrassed about ourselves, those things are really the trauma, and we hide it, you know, within an ego, an egoic package that looks pretty. And from a physical, we can talk about it later more, but like, it's really almost as if, imagine you are a ball, like a ball made of Play-Doh, okay? And suddenly trauma is something that, like an arrow, hits the ball. So imagine this ball is hit on one side by this arrow, which traumatizes the ball. Now, this Play-Doh ball that was round at the beginning now has a hole that has the shape of the arrow. And on the other side, on the opposite side, there is a protrusion that emerges that has the shape of the arrow as well. So that's the ego. So now the ball believes of being better than the other balls, or because now it's bigger. It has a shape that is like grandiose and bigger and different and sharper, right? But the reality is that that shape is as big as the trauma underneath it, you know, is as big and as beautiful as much as ugly and empty and dark is the hole and the trauma that created it. So that's really the biggest lie in our society, the original sin, I would say, that we cover up our trauma with ego to not see that we're hurt.
And this is an unconscious process, so it's not something that, like, at least in the beginning, maybe there is a little bit of consciousness to it where you have to decide, okay, and it's at a very deep level, you're deciding, okay, I can't face this, it's too intense for me. Whatever I just experienced, I need to not feel this. I need to put it in a place where it's not affecting me, where I don't have to face the full intensity of it. And that's where the ego starts coming in. And that's where you build these patterns of just continually like pushing things down, you know, covering them up. And it's like what you said with the analogy. I really like that analogy of the arrow piercing the ball of Play-Doh. But it's almost like you're deciding to swallow that void that's been created inside of you. And it might, you know, because there's extra space inside of you, you might seem bigger on the outside, but really it's based on this emptiness and this hollowness and it's like these little pockets of trauma inside of you that are just very deeply buried. And it's true when
And
they come to the
oftentimes it's
light.
very subconscious.
Yeah, that's what I was
Oftentimes
gonna
it's very
say. Yeah,
subconscious. Not that people, even if it's decided, like some people, I think there is a moment in which people decide they don't want
exactly.
to see the trauma. There
Very,
is
very
just a
early on.
brief moment, but it's so brief. Yeah, it's just very like a click. You're
Hmm.
like, this is traumatic. Okay, no. Life is beautiful, you know, it's really
It's
like
not like you're
this. I feel
thinking that.
like
It's
it's
just a
that
snap.
second.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's a switch. And once you turn that switch on, then from then on, it's like you put a lens on and everything is pink because you forget about the darkness behind you. You know, it's just like And so you're just living a lie. You're just living a fake, a false narrative of who you are for real, who you are for people, what people think about you around, all of those things are just start building a lie. And that's the ego that perpetuates itself. Sorry, but please continue.
Yeah, I mean, you basically took the thought from me, so that's perfect. It's exactly what you said. It's this tiny, tiny, minuscule moment where you come to a decision. It's not like, again, you're not thinking, okay, no, this is too intense. It's just a snap moment judgment, and like almost like a very, very subconscious level decision that if you're aware enough, you might be able to catch. But for most people, it slips by unnoticed. And especially after there's a habitual pattern to suppress. When you start getting into this habit pattern where instead of feeling things, you suppress things, then it does happen automatically and unconsciously. And you get to a place where rather than letting these feelings express themselves, which is the only way that they'll truly release, you shove them down. And then it's like trying to hold a bubble of air underneath the water. Maybe with your hands, you can kind of bring it down, you can move it to another area, but it's going to find a way to bubble back up to the surface at some point. And this, you know, perpetuates the cycle of abuse and victimhood because, either this bubble is going to come out in a way that then puts you as the abuser, puts you in the situation where you're creating pain and suffering for someone else, or it bubbles up on the inside and makes you feel the pain again in yourself. And this time you might not know what's causing it. It might just be, oh, I woke up this morning and I'm feeling depressed and I don't know why. But really it's because of a trauma that you've suppressed from even years ago, from your early childhood. And most people, that brings me to a really important subject, which is, the inner child. And I think that it's a very, very rare person that has a very wholesome, untraumatic childhood. We all have had moments in our childhood where we've experienced pain. And especially with the developing mind, unless we were in an environment where it was specifically very, very open, we felt very safe and protected, and we felt like we were able to express anything, which is, again, a very rare situation because, again, most parents aren't fully aware of how to deal with trauma. And so they pass on these patterns of suppression through the generations to to their children through the family. And when you're in that kind of environment, you see, you mirror your behaviors of the people around you, especially when you're a little child. So you see other people, your parents, other relatives, people that are models to you in the early development of your awareness and your consciousness and your brain suppressing things. And so you learn that it's a learned behavior and you start to do it yourself. But when these happen, especially in early childhood, they're, before the memories are really solidified in our brain, it's gonna shape the very core essence of how you interact in the world at a very, very deep level of the subconscious mind. So when you start doing work to release these things, you might find that some very old memories bubble up to the surface, or you have certain realizations about the ways that you act in the world and how that could have been passed maybe through the generations or from early childhood experience. But for many people, this is just kind of this mystery gray zone. It's kind of like hidden in the fog of your memory where you might have had some traumas from your early childhood that are you know basically the core of how you deal with the same situations that present themselves in your life now. Like, let's say you had a parent figure who, whenever they got really angry, they just completely shut down and they couldn't process anything. So you learn that behavior from them. And then whenever you get really angry, you also shut down because that's the way that you saw to process that trauma. And that's what you integrated into yourself. And you might not have any idea why this happens to you. You just might feel, okay, when I get angry, I get really overwhelmed and I can't think and I can't process and I can't do anything. But really this is a learned behavior. And so in the process of healing, in the process of understanding your trauma, it's really important, again, going back to this statement we've been touching on in a lot of our episodes, which is the witness modality. When you start having these really strong feelings come up, and especially when you don't know where they're coming from, it's critical, it's crucial to take a step back from the situation, to simply observe. And one of the best ways to do this is to just bring your awareness to the breath, the process of breathing in and breathing out, anchoring your awareness at this action. And from this standpoint, that's separate from your mind, that's separate from the emotions that are swirling inside of you, just witness and see what they're feeling like, and try not to let yourself become attached to them. Try to see them as almost like an outside factor that's affecting you. And if you're able to do this for long enough, you might start to understand some of the deeper cores of why this is happening. You might get a glimpse of inspiration that shows you, okay, this is one of the events that started to form this trauma. Or you might not have that, but you might still be able to release some of that by just witnessing that emotion, witnessing its expression, not judging it, not letting yourself fall back into the loop of just collapsing like you used to do, but instead to just sit and experience and let it pass, because everything does pass eventually. That's one of the beautiful things about this world. Nothing in this physical world is eternal. Everything will pass. No matter how good something is, it is temporary. No matter how bad something is, it will go away. So even if you're stuck at the lowest point of your existence, it's not going to be forever. It's going to change eventually. And you just have to be able to take yourself a little bit out into the witness modality and witness that and be with that and watch it slip away and let yourself move on from it.
Absolutely. And I like what you said about the energy, lacking these energy, because what the trauma does, I like describing things from a physical standpoint, because ultimately our universe is nothing else than physical. It's really physical. There is like a non-physical reality, that is the divine part of it. But we are living in the physical world. And in the physical world, it's all about physics. Even from an energetic standpoint, it's all about physics in the end. So I like describing things like this, and I like that you said it is an energy that you have to just disperse through the witness modality. Because if you, instead of dispersing it, become an active contributor to the perpetuation of this trauma, like you did at the beginning, like with the compulsive thinking, then you just perpetuate it. You're feeding the cycle. And instead, if you just sit back and look at it and you wait for it to disperse, it just goes away in just a matter of time. And it was a matter of time, no matter what you would do. It is us who add energy to it. And so you feed the cycle. And again, I like that you also mentioned these different ways of dealing with it, because I think also there is a genetic component, there is a learning component. And ultimately, we do what we know how to do, in a sense. Like, we all tend to stay within our comfort zone, which is simply what we know already what to do, how to do. And that comfort zone also depends on the things we are surrounded by and the behaviors we are surrounded by. So if our family tends to ruminate and go into depression when trauma happens, then we learn that. And we also tend to have more on our topic, our brain tends to be more anatomically prone, due to the genetic side of it, to go into that specific type of response to trauma. There are people instead who are more than on the narcissistic side instead, who tend to have more predatory behaviors. And so these arrow, that hits them and creates these void, this hole, this trauma, and then becomes a protrusion on the other side, then they start using that protrusion to hurt others in order for them to disperse this trauma. And so they keep hurting others, becoming the same arrow. They hit them against other people. And instead, other people tend to go back to themselves. And so they go in cycle. And so these arrow, they hit them, becomes the same arrow, they hit themselves again. So they perpetuate the trauma. And so they become toxic for themselves. And so it's really like, physically speaking, we have these two ways of responding to trauma. Some people go back to themselves in a compulsive way, and some people perpetuate the trauma onto others. And sometimes it's also when the trauma is too much, because I think it has to do a lot with the size of our amygdala, in a sense. There are certain, like, if your amygdala is big enough that you can handle the trauma and the re-traumatizing that you do to yourself, then your amygdala grows and grows and grows. And so you can go back to yourself and it grows. And some people instead, it becomes so much that their amygdala or their brain, or this is my personal view on it, it's not able to support that kind of trauma, that kind of pain. And so it has to expand itself, including other people's brains, other people's amygdala. So basically, this trauma, because the brain can't handle it, is using other brains to be dispersed. And so this is what happens to people who have deep unresolved trauma and become narcissistic and abuse others. That for them is so unbearable that instead of remunenating and suppress the or disperse the trauma through their own body, they need more bodies to disperse the trauma, and so they have to give trauma to others because the energy is too much. So that's really what happens, and so they cause other people to develop PTSD, and their amygdala gets bigger, and their brain starts developing certain structures like compulsive thinking. So they're basically outsourcing the dispersion of the pain because they can't handle it all on their own, or because they don't want to handle it all on their own, and so it's too much, and so they let it flow. But by letting it flow, they abuse others. That's the way in which the trauma flows, because that's the way that it is, right? It's trauma. So if you let the trauma flow, it means you're traumatizing other people, and they become traumatized, and then some people become a cushion to this dispersion, which are people like you, like me, people who then, instead of becoming abusers, tend to enter into their compulsive thinking, and they become the cushion to the dispersion of this trauma, because they stop perpetuating the trauma onto others, but at the same time they also absorb all of it, and so at that point we need to disperse it. So that's really how the universe works. There are some layers that are traumatized and push onto other layers, and some other layers that become the crust, that stops dispersing and just stops the dispersion of the trauma, and become the cushion, the blockage, the wall that prevents the trauma from further perpetuating, and instead and then in this a second way of reacting, but there is a third way of reacting, which is ultimately we all tend to get to that level, which is the transmutation of the trauma. So like the caterpillar becomes a butterfly. It's that trauma that finally transmutes into the flower, and so some people, like we did that, Robbie, like the fact that we had a Kundalini awakening, it's also thanks to that trauma, like the fact that we are blooming into this podcast, is the flower that has emerged from our traumas, and so we are blooming. And so I call people like us energy transmuters, people that have gotten to the level of understanding that if you witness the trauma enough, not only just witness it, but if you let the trauma flow through you enough, the trauma changes you, and it changes you into a flower, and so it changes you in a positive way, because it's just like, and so you transmute that energy into blooming, the blossom. And so there are various ways of responding to trauma, but ultimately, I think they also kind of overlap with different levels of also chakra activation, for example, or different levels of spiritual awakening, because people that are in the lowest level of spiritual awakening tend to be the ones, perpetuating the trauma, because they have nowhere else to go. They have to perpetuate. And then people who are at the crown chakra are those who finally have the space to bloom, right? So it's really a matter of activating more and more at a higher state, and the higher you go, the more you have space to bloom and to become the light that shines, because you have finally dispersed all these traumatic energy, all these traumatic experiences, and healed from them, and get rid of the darkness, and gotten to, it's like the Play-Doh ball that gets back all the way around to the point of exposing its inside to the world in a beautiful way, instead of keeping it in as darkness, it becomes light. So this is just metaphors, but from a physical energetic standpoint, this is really, I think, what happens with trauma and the ego in general. What is your thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, and kind of one thing that I wanted to bring to this discussion is I mean, it's a concept from Buddhism, but one of the things the Buddha said, and it was one of the first things he said actually, like life, like this existence is suffering, you know? And when you look at that from just the first perspective, when you just take a second and sit with it, you think, okay, then what's the point? This is all just terrible. Like everything is suffering. But, and also for a lot of people, that suffering actually makes them have doubts, like spiritual doubts, where they lose faith because of their suffering, right? They're like, okay, if there is an all loving, all powerful God, how could this suffering exist in the world? And that's like a really big kind of like block for a lot of people in order to really come into the spiritual mindset and then to come into a place where they do start to have some faith in something greater than themselves. And from the yogic perspective, this actually is a really interesting solution. So basically, in the cosmology of the universe, in the yogic belief, there's something called the day of Brahma and the night of Brahma. And Brahma basically is, the ground state consciousness of the universe. So in the day, everything flourishes into manifestation. You have the three-dimensional world around us. We have all of these different forms and different seemingly separate things. And then in the night, everything comes back into its potential form and rests in the unconscious or deeply like conscious void of all potential experience, right? And so supposedly for the first few cycles of creation, because again, in the yogic system, it's believed that everything is cyclical. It's again the same with the Buddhist perspective. You have the wheel of samsara. It's this constant loop that never ends. It always just kind of loops back on itself. And the first few loops per se, it said that the world was created without any suffering. All beings were born perfect, but nothing really happened because everyone was immediately enlightened. They all just transmuted themselves back into the pure source consciousness. And because the initial reason why this universe was created, according again to one kind of analysis of the yogic perspective, is because it can, because it's something that is innately, it's like a play. It's a divine play, and in order for the play to exist, there has to be different shades. And if everything is just the one shade of complete bliss and perfection, there's nothing to compare and contrast that to. So because of that, this darkness, this aspect of trauma was created. But this trauma was created out of the most love possible because it gave the beings that were in this plane, forgot their identity as the true self, as the source. It gave them a window. It gave them kind of like this rope ladder dangling down from, the heights of enlightenment. It gave them this reminder that there was something else because this darkness had to contrast with the brightest bright. The darkest dark and the lightest light need to both exist in order for one of them to exist. It's this aspect of duality. So because of that, when you experience these deep dark traumas, you can even it forces you to kind of come to this breakthrough point where you're like, okay, if this exists, then there has to be something else. And it forces you to kind of expand outwards. And when you start to expand, then you can start to bring in the light and you start to understand that, both things are really all the same love, but they're just done out of, the play of this world where everything is just a play for fun in the grand greatest picture of the universe. Everything is Nothing is serious. Everything is temporary, but everything is all for the fun of the creation. Um, so I think that in that sense, both at the kind of relative aspect of where we're at and also the highest aspect, this trauma really exists as a gesture of love to help remind us of our truest form. And it's something that's difficult to kind of grasp onto until you've started to experience some of the lighter aspects of this creation. And I know that if, from my personal experience, when you're kind of stuck in that depressive loop, it can really be difficult to see any light in the world. But just know that at the bottom as well as at the top, there is this source of light that can come into you.
Absolutely, love what you said. I have my own belief system as well, but I think it's uh, based on my own personal experience, we do live in a physical reality which is built through pain, and there is also a non-physical reality which is the mystical, the divine, what we call God, which is kind of like the environment within which, inside which all the physical reality happens, but it's also kind of separate. It's a completely separate reality in which it's almost like the concept of heaven as compared to being on earth. They're really two completely separate things. but this is where the reality within which we move. And there's also a divine side of it, a mystical side of it that has nothing to do with physical laws, and it's just love and light and compassion. So talking about the physical reality, because trauma has a lot to do with physics instead. So I've written a book that I'd love to show you, but unfortunately it's too far from me. It's on the table. The book is called The Fractal Universe and the Theory of Everything. And you can find it on my website at 360holisticcoach.com or on Amazon, looking for my name and the name of the book. And I describe the universe like the Big Bang as the trauma, the main trauma that really created us. So basically we were just one, and then the Big Bang caused the universe to be traumatized by a collision or an explosion. We don't know, it could be a collision as well. And that has caused this trauma to be perpetuated. So we're born through trauma. So this completely fits actually with the Buddhist and with the yogic perspective, in which they believe that trauma is actually part of life, that trauma is part of our existence, because ultimately, without the Big Bang, we will not be here as forms. We exist as forms because the trauma has caused the universe to expand, and for the universe to expand, it had to also decrease in terms of density and create all of these separate forms and be divided in the spectrum that goes from pure light to pure darkness, And so there's a spectrum, like everything is a spectrum, as much as light and dark, physical matter, like very dense physical matter and very rarefied physical matter. So the universe is nothing else really than a spectrum of matter and energy that goes from the densest and from the brightest, or from the to the lightest, to the darkest. So this is what the universe is, and this is what the Big Bang has done. But the Big Bang has done so through trauma. So ultimately we are born because of trauma, because the universe is expanding, and this push to expand is translated into the physicality of having children, of having fruits, or making things pop out of something in the universe. We make seeds. Everything in the universe works in the same way. In the end, we have children as much as a tree makes a plum or a seed. So it's the same kind of physical process, something that pops out of somewhere else due to trauma. And even our families, like oftentimes, how many kids have been conceived through trauma, through toxic relationship, through alcohol, through drugs, through things. So even if this is hard to swallow, we often are actually the result of trauma. And so while growing up, we already have this trauma to disperse. We already are born through trauma. And so we have already a content of trauma that we need to disperse for us to be able to be free from trauma. And so that's what our life in the end becomes. Our growth becomes just the mean to disperse that trauma, because that trauma, the energy of the trauma, is also the energy that pushes us to grow. We grow thanks to the trauma. And once we finally grow and we disperse all that energy, we can finally be clear-minded enough and awakened enough to understand, oh, I just went through trauma, so we really awaken. Like I usually use this metaphor, this analogy. Imagine you hit your little toe on a piece of furniture, that usually is a very, very strong traumatizing pain for most people. And so when that happens, you always have that moment of really strong, sharp pain in which you completely lose consciousness, and you're like, I didn't even know what happened. You enter into this state of real trauma in which you don't even know what has just happened to you. Then as the pain fades away, as that trauma disperses itself, then you regain consciousness and you remember, oh, okay, I just hit my little toe. It was nothing. It's just something temporary, right? But initially you're in this space of unconsciousness due to trauma. And so this is what happened to us as a universe. It's almost as if the universe, because of the traumatic experience of the Big Bang that scattered around everything and made everything explode. It caused a trauma that now is dispersing. And so we all are also under that traumatic energy that makes us be unconscious. And once we finally grow and reach the top of our growth and the highest growth we can reach, we finally disperse all of our energy and we start slowly regaining consciousness and awakening to trauma, to the ego, and then thanks to that, thanks to realizing that those things were making us being unconscious, then we can realize, we can see the rest, we can see the highest states, we can see above instead of just being in the lowest forms, you know. So I think it has a lot to do with it's really physics. It's really like quantum physics. From a quantum physics standpoint, we really have to reach a level of awakening. We have to get outside of the traumatic energy that keeps us unconscious and that keeps us within the ego for us to forget about the trauma, about that trauma that makes us suffer, about the suffering. We create the ego because that ego is kind of like an analgesic, you know, it's an anesthetic. It gives us the feeling that we are not traumatized, and it allows us to keep going despite we are in pain, you know. And so the ego ultimately is very functional to growth, functional to perpetuating, to keep going even though we're going through trauma, right? And so it's just a way of basically really like you know, makes it like alleviating our pain so that we can keep going and we can believe in a narrative that is really false, but just as a way of forgetting about the pain so that we can keep going, because ultimately that process is inevitable. That pain is already in us. We have already been conceived through pain. We already have that pain because growing up requires pain, but we can't think about pain all the time because that's painful and that will just stop us from growing. So we need to find another way. So that's the ego. But then once we have used the function that the ego had initially, we need to get rid of it because that was just something needed until we were traumatized. But once we heal for trauma, we really need to also reach the ego depth. And we do, as long as we understand that that's a process, that's the process. And I like what you said also about the families, the fact that different people react in different ways, because this is also a matter of like understanding that we need to step outside of our comfort zone for us to be able to really overcome trauma, to really overcome the ego, and to see the rest. So I think also there is a lot to say about, and again, we're going to be just briefly touching on these things, but we're going to be talking more about this in the following episodes. But there is a lot about, you know, we said that we need to disperse this trauma, but oftentimes instead of dispersing it, we in fact keep perpetuating it by adding things from the outside. And part of it is also due to our society, because as long as we're unconscious, we are great customers, we're great patients, we take medicines, you know, we become consumers. And so the world needs us to be unconscious and traumatized because that perpetuates the areas of our brain that are more prone to compulsive shopping, to compulsive behaviors and unconscious behaviors that then lead us to have illnesses. And so we are perfect for society as long as we are unconscious. When we start awakening, then we become useless, right? And so how do you want to say something about that?
Well, I just was going to say that this is a big factor that you need to overcome in the process of awakening, because there is this very big pressure, and this is like almost like a downward current of consciousness that's perpetuated by the society that we live in. Because as you said, if we awaken, then we're not part of that system of trauma anymore, and we can't be controlled in the same way. So there's a big incentive from society and the powers that, you know, are controlling it to keep us in this state of suffering, to keep us in this state of trauma, to keep us in fight or flight. Because you think about it, when an animal is in fight or flight, it's very easy to control its behaviors. You come in with a small incentive, a source. Let's say you trap it in a box with a small little hole in the side, and then you scare the animal. It's going to run right out that hole, and you know exactly what it's going to do every time. And the systems that have been put in place by those in power that are controlling the systems, they know this and they know how we behave in these situations. So they know with the right stimuli that we're very easy to control. And then all of our energy and our consciousness can be exploited for, the gain of the few. And because of this, it really it is a difficult thing to awaken in today's day and age. Although we do see a lot of people doing it also, which is very good, because there's two sides of it, right? There's this downwards current that's coming from society that's very strong, that's kind of keeping us in this box, that's keeping us locked in our suffering, that's keeping us stuck in the mode of fight or flight. But then I think as an unconsciousness of those in power, they didn't realize that because of how strong this downward force is, it's pushing people so strongly that they're starting to reach these deeper points of suffering. And because they're under this pressure of suffering, they're expanding back outwards into consciousness. They're undergoing this awakening process. And I think that is something that is, it's kind of countering that. And it's almost like it's this loop. Imagine like you have, let's say something that floats on top of the water, because let's say a leaf, and it's underneath a very heavy current of water. And this heavy current of water is the pressure of society. At first, this water is going to push the leaf very down into the base of the pool. But because the leaf is buoyant, eventually it's going to find a way to float back up to the surface. And so what is happening now, and I think in our society, is that because of all of these downward pressures, and especially I think a big factor was around the time of COVID, because whether whatever you think about COVID, one thing that we can say for sure is that it put people into a very small box. It put people into a state where they're experiencing an abnormally high amount of isolation and suffering. And what a lot of people saw during this period is a big spiritual awakening. They were forced to see their trauma for the first time. And because of that increased trauma load, which I think is a term we could maybe use to discuss this, like this trauma load was so intense that it forced people to kind of break through it, because it was this intensity was so high that it just the power of their ego that created this illusion shattered to a certain extent. And that's something that I think I see also in my own personal experience, but in the world as a whole, is that the ego is almost like a substance. It's like it does have some sort of properties to it, and if there's enough pressure on it, it will shatter. And through these cracks that are formed under the intense pressure of suffering, that's where the light can seep in. Imagine it's like, this very, very dark piece of black glass in a sphere that surrounds you at all times. So that whatever you're looking at in the world is clouded through this obscuring black glass. It's not letting in any of the natural light. You see everything as these black shadow forms. But the more and more trauma that's on the outside, it's like the more and more pressure that's on the outside of this sphere. And even though, this pressure at first just looks like more and more darkness, making everything look darker and darker, eventually the pressure is going to get too intense and it's going to create some cracks. And once these cracks form, that's when you can start to see the light. And once the light starts getting in, then you kind of have the power again to dissolve this sphere from the inside. So I think that's something that, it works in both ways. It both, under certain circumstances, these pressures from society can really keep us in this box, can keep us molded, especially when people are, I guess lesser on their journey, lesser developed. Doesn't mean they're lesser as a person. It just means that they've, undergone less of the journey of awakening that, according to, the Eastern perspective, takes thousands and thousands of lifetimes to fully achieve. Um, but they get kind of more stuck into these traps. But the more pressure that's coming from the outside, also the more people that now the pressure becomes intense enough that they can start to have these awakening experiences and start to, step out of their boundaries, start to step out of the shell of trauma that's been cast around them by their ego and by these pressures from society. So I think it's both things. It's both. It's really what it's doing is it's speeding up the process of our collective awakening because of this intensity of the pressure of the suffering that's been put on us, especially again going back to the example of COVID, where this is just accelerating everything. It's both making a lot more trauma in the world, creating a lot more suffering at one specific point, but it's also allowing for more and more cracks to form in this shell of, illusion that's been created around us, both by society and by our egoic reactions to these pressures. So I think in the coming years, we're going to see more and more people awaken as maybe the seeming outside situation in the world deteriorates, or there's more strife in the world, there's more external negative pressures. We're going to see a counteracting wave of this light awakening that's going to come forth as a result of that, because of the weight of this pressure that we see from this speeding up of trauma.
Absolutely. I think, and like I think what people in power have not understood is that this is how the universe is designed. So I see the universe as like a tree, okay? If you push a little bit, you make leaves, you make branches, then you push a little more and you make leaves. If you push more, you make flowers, and the flowers awaken and stop growing. And at that point, they just shine beauty. So that's really how we function in general. The universe, we are the universe. We are part of it, and so we are it. We function the same way. Everything in the universe functions in the same exact way. We react to trauma with blooming. And when I say blooming, I mean consciousness. I mean that we react to trauma by growing to the point of reaching a spiritual growth and a spiritual awakening, a spiritual awareness. So it's just inevitable. It's just how the engine of the universe works. The more you traumatize it, the more a flower pops out on the other side. So it's just a matter of time. And so I feel like from one side, people in power know that, and that's why they have created and they nurture our ego constantly through the beauty industry, because they understood that if people suffer too much, I'm sure we have undergone this cycle multiple times through history. We just forget, because every time there is some reset button, like a war that destroys our knowledge, our know-how, and that causes a new generational trauma, But we have gone through these cycles multiple times already, and every time we make a little bit of a step forward, because it's just inevitable. And they also, these people that cause our trauma are really, they don't understand that they're having their own function, which is to perpetuate the trauma so that we grow and we reach our higher states of consciousness. And so it's just inevitable. It's all part, there's only one journey, and it's inevitable. Baba Ram Das said, and it is true. It's really how it works. And so the more we get traumatized, the more we awaken. That's really how it's going to happen, how it is happening. And the ego can just simply put like patches on top so that it delays the process of awakening, because it nurtures us. It makes us forget about the trauma, and it makes us stay stuck in a version of ourselves that we don't want to live anymore, because at that point we become afraid of seeing the trauma itself. And so that is what the ego does. It kind of stops people and it keeps people stuck. And now it's happening through drugs, for example, drugs like antidepressants. Antidepressants are really things that keep people numb and keep people physiologically incapable of awakening. Those, as much as many others that, for example, contraception kind of pills, those also have a huge hormonal effect that completely changes people's psychology and the way of functioning, and keep them into this like numbness, of like not lack of capability of responding to trauma properly, or painkillers. Pain is necessary to awaken. If you kill your pain, you're not doing what you're supposed to do. And so all these things are just analgesics, or just anesthetics that we are given from the society. And so I believe people in power have already understood this, because the more the population goes through wars and suffering and death and hunger, the more the population awakens. And so they know, because this has happened a lot of times in history. This has happened every time, to the point of the French Revolution, in which the population has been put through so much suffering that they have guillotined the elites. So people in power know exactly this. And so what they're doing now is they're trying to implement a society in which, yes, we go through suffering, because suffering is what they use for us to perpetuate capitalism, because we're simply being made into warehouses in which we produce pathologies. We produce illnesses that then someone sells the pill for. And then we eat junk food that causes illnesses that then we're sold pill for, and then we develop side effects, and then we're sold another pill for it. So that's really what we have to become. We're just, industries that produce illnesses ultimately.
Right.
But this game can be perpetuated only if we are kept in this very narrow window of traumatized but egoic state in which we don't see the trauma, we don't see what is going on, and we believe we're actually great. And this is summarized in the United States with American culture, in which people in the United States are ego-fed to believe that the United States are the center of everything and they're better than everybody else. And this is really a farm. Like, people here are really abused from the moment they're born and to the moment they die, just for capitalistic purposes, But they believe they're better. Because they believe they're better, they never see that they're being abused. So that's what the ego does, And so the ego is really poison because it doesn't allow us to see the trauma and to awaken from it and to go through it and to just, and the problem is that people tend to become very also weak, because now, for example, here, because people tend to be very ego-fed all the time, then even having communication, like truthful and transparent communication with people, became very difficult because everybody gets offended as soon as you say the truth. The truth, which is the only way of healing, became offensive. And people censor themselves and filters themselves and censor others through peer pressure. And you have to be politically correct. And you cannot say this and you cannot say that because you have to be inclusive. But by doing that, they're censoring themselves, they're filtering themselves all the time. And they're not allowing themselves to actually see the truth, which is that they are being abused. That they have to go through this trauma of remembering that they're being abused. And through that, they can reach the ego death. So this is really the narrow window within which people are being kept, which is the window of traumatized but better than others because of that. You
It's the two
spend
sides of the ego.
$10,000. Yeah, you spend you start a student loan and you start being in debt for life, but you're better for it. You're cool because you have a student loan. Or you work 30 hours, 24 hours a day for a company that abuses you. But you're better for it because, you're cool. You work so much.
Because you
This
have a
is
good
the
job
Stockholm
title. Yeah.
syndrome that we're given in society, that keeps us traumatized but egoic, so that we never awaken from this matrix, So this is why also the ego and trauma are so linked, so tightly linked to each other.
Basically, one thing that I really see also in terms of the trauma and the ego and how these things fit together, it's the theme of separation, right? Because both you have the ego that gives you this sense of grandiosity that makes you feel separate and therefore better from the people and the things around you. So it's kind of feeding this aspect that keeps you separate from a seemingly higher perspective. And then internally, you have the force of the ego that's making you feel separate from your true inner higher self. And this comes in the form of feeling like depression and feeling not good enough. So I think these forms of separation, both of them fit together. And really, when you come into peace, when you come into awakening, you have this sense of wholeness. And this wholeness comes from not seeing yourself as separate from the world around you, not seeing yourself as separate from the higher layers, the higher aspects of yourself, really allowing these things to flow and to become one. And the role of the ego and the way that it's perpetuated keeps you in this field of separation, which in some sense, and this is from the yogic perspective of the word ego, in order to exist in this three-dimensional world, from the yogic perspective, you do need to have a very slight degree of ego. And this is what keeps you being able to see yourself in some ways as separate from everything else. But in the terms of ego that we're using in this discussion, it's a different definition. And this is the ego as the root of the suffering. So just wanted to put that out there as a point. But yeah, and also to lead into the next phase of this conversation before we end, this is something that I think is also really important, because when you get into these states of ego dependence and ego conditioning, there's many things that can re-trigger this trauma that comes from an initial source, but it can be from anything that you consume. And I know that this is something that can really affect you in many different ways. So it can be like even the food that you eat or the things that you consume. All of these things can be re-triggering to your ego. And I know, Nancy, you have something else you wanted to add about this, so I'll pass it over to you now, and you could talk about how this re-triggering can really keep us locked in this cycle of suffering.
Absolutely, because it's all about like it's energetic and biochemical as well, because ultimately in our universe communicates things through matter and through energy. And so if we, there are things that contain the energy of trauma, the energy of suffering, like molecules, like cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone, and we produce it as much as animals produce. And so if you eat meat that has been produced through stress and through suffering, then you eat hormones and you eat substances, and as much as your body will produce them and contain them. If you go through trauma, an animal will produce them and contain them if they go through trauma. And so when you eat those things, you're just increasing your level of trauma, because you're not only producing your own, you're also adding those things from the outside. And from an energetic standpoint also, meat or produce or like any form of food that has been produced through suffering and trauma. And sometimes it's just making things not with love, but with hate or without passion, like also that, like every energy, the energy that we have when we touch things transfers to everything. And so it's also, not just transfers from an energetic standpoint, but when you do something without love, you're clumsy, and because you're clumsy, it doesn't look good and it doesn't taste good and it's not properly cooked. And so when you eat something that has a chemical composition that is the composition of something that has not been made with love, because it's not perfect, it's not perfectly cooked, for example.
Right.
So really it has a lot of different components that, and not only that, but also we can absorb trauma through movies, horror movies, for example, like movies that perpetuate violence, that give us violence. So we already have those thoughts. We already have that kind of trauma. And if we further introduce that traumatic energy through movies, through songs, through things that perpetuate that kind of thinking, even songs, not just violent songs, but songs that talk about codependency, for example. Like a lot of songs talk about codependent and toxic relationships in ways that they normalize them and they make us re-enter that kind of state and mind rumination that you were talking about at the beginning.
Right.
So when there's so many things around us that are a reflection of trauma of the person that makes those things, of trauma and not healthy, not healed perspectives, that then we can absorb those things, and so we can add trauma to our own trauma. We can add ego to our own ego. So we can have those things from the outside, from food, from movies, from people around us that are traumatized. And when they talk to us, our parents, our family, our friends, when they talk to us, they transfer our rumination or their frustrations or their like any sort of negative traumatized energy that is reflective of the trauma. We absorb it. And we don't actually, we basically put more meat, we pile up more stuff. Now at that point, we have to still disperse. It's all energy, traumatic energy that we need to disperse on top of the one we already had as at birth. So we really like getting rid of trauma takes time, because we also continue adding stuff on top, and we're going to touch more about all of these different things, especially food and movies, and how all of these things can help you grow and help you reach a spiritual evolution, a spiritual awakening, or can actually bring you down and bring you more into a traumatized state that then you need to make more effort to disperse and to heal from.
So I think, one quick more point before we end is just to help you understand how much trauma can be passed, even from the space around you. Think about the last time that you were ever witnessing two people arguing. Maybe they were like in a serious fight, and you were in the same space as them. You weren't involved in their situation at all, but you could still feel this tension, this kind of heavy energy in the air. So this basically, we exist in a field of awareness, and it has the capacity to carry frequencies, whether they be positive or negative. So even just by being around some of these lower, more traumatic frequencies, you can start to pick them up. If you don't have strong defenses, you can start to internalize them and they can affect you as well. But yeah, that's kind of how I want to end this episode. And thank you, Nancy. It was a beautiful conversation. I hope that all the listeners out there got a lot and maybe started to understand their trauma a little bit more, or about how to understand the role of the trauma in their own experience, your own life, and how maybe you can start to move past that and see things from a more holistic perspective. So thank you for joining us on this episode today.
Yes, thank you, Robbie. I love this episode. And again, like this really like every episode is like a Russian doll kind of box of things that then we're gonna be touch on more in the next episode. And if you want to know more, like know more about our books or what we do, we're gonna give you our Instagram websites. My website is 360holisticcoach.com, and you can find my books and my events and more information about what I do and my coaching practice. And if you want to get in contact with me and ask me, questions, or you want to be coached or help in a spiritual way, you can contact me. And Robbie has an Instagram handle as well.
Right. So yeah, you can find me on Instagram. It's at Robie Newman-Paris, and that link will be in the description as well. Website is still in development, so it'll be up soon. Also, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram with any questions, any comments, anything you'd like to know more on. I also teach different types of yoga and meditation and breathing techniques. So if you're interested in learning more about any of those things or booking a private consultation, I'd be happy to reach out to you, or be happy to answer your message once you reach out to me. So look forward to hearing back from you, and thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next episode.